Pokemon games are known for their deep and expansive lore, but have you ever wondered to yourself, why is it so gosh diddly darn confusing? Over 25 years of history and 37 games of the mainline series, and not one clear answer about the canonical timelines. Until today. So strap in as I demystify the Pokemon mainline canonical timelines. Well, here we are again. Look, the Pokemon franchise, we love it. Every day I'm thinking, wow, what a great franchise. I mean, look at this goopy guy. Look at him. Everyone knows about it. Great franchise. But the canonical timeline? What's with that? Why is it so confusing? Like, for real, with the amount of time and effort I put into decoding the timelines for this video, I probably could have gone and got a whole ass undergraduate degree. And I'm not even kidding. A little bit I am, but it's a lot of effort. In my last video, I made some predictions about the content of Legends Z to A. And a lot of those predictions revolved very heavily around the choosing and solidifying of canonical timelines by Game Freak. My main assertion being that the timelines are too goddamn confusing. And as Game Freak is centering more of its stories around time travel, they need to be more explicit with what canonical timeline we're actually in. And oh boy, the comments on that video really proved my point. Everyone was coming out of the woodwork with their understanding of the timelines and framing them as fact. Much appreciated for bolstering my argument, as you all had different opinions, but unfortunately, not everyone can be right. Especially Jared. He was specifically the most wrong. So I've decided to make this little video explaining, with as much evidence as I could collect, the structure and continuity of the mainline Pokemon games' canonical narrative timelines, so that you, my loyal viewer, will not be confused. That was a mouthful. And hey, while you're here, this was a monster of a video to write, research, film, and edit. So why don't you just chuck me a little itty bitty, a little subscribe, just a few clicks, maybe a like, maybe a comment. But that would be greatly appreciated. I'll appreciate you at the gates. Thank you. Now, I know your mum is eagerly awaiting that Riddler coup video, and let it be known, it is coming. But have her chew on this one a bit for a while, okay? If you could let her know, send that message across to her, that would be great. Me and her, we have a bit of a tenuous relationship right now. I'm constantly busy, you know? I'm a busy man. I gotta go to work, come home, read only about Pokemon lore, you know, busy guy. So pass that along to her, that would be great. So hi, I'm your host Patrick. I usually make videos for your mum about Pokemon, and today we will be decoding Pokemon's stupid and silly canonical timelines. Alright, first off, to be incredibly clear, we are talking about the canonical narrative timelines of the mainline series games. Only the timelines that the player character can actually play from red, blue, green, yellow, all the way up through Scarlet and Violet. This is going to include Legends games and Let's Go. You'll see why as we get into it. But to be clear, no spin-offs, no anime, no potential set of infinite timelines in the multiverse, just the timelines of the mainline games. That's it. So what is a timeline? Well, for definitional purposes, it is a set of interreliant temporal and spatial events that follow a strict chronology. All the events in a timeline must be consistent, and their specific time and place must be reasonably verifiable between games residing in the same timelines. Cool?
So how do we differentiate between separate canonical timelines?
Great question. Bob, is that your name, Bob? Great question, Bob. Well, we do this through discovering evidence that would invalidate a pre-established temporal fact between two games. For example, the ultimate weapon being fired. If we can confirm that it was fired in one game and not in another, we can establish two distinct timelines for those two games. Or a more general example, if two iterations of the same event have different confirmed dates between games, we can establish separate timelines for either game. Does that make sense? You know, if you're a little 12-year-old freak watching this video and you don't quite understand, I got you with the Fortnite terms. Let me break it down. John Wick First Jump Off Battle Bus, May 16th, 2019, Chapter 3. If in Chapter 4 we find out John Wick Jump Off Battle Bus for the first time June 4th, 2022, Chapter 4 separate timeline from Chapter 3. Understand? Thanks, good, great, got it. Now for my methodology. We will primarily be using in-game evidence such as Pokédex entries, character dialogue, item descriptions, and also any official media released alongside the games to create our temporal markers. Official media is important as official releases are used to help further players' understandings of things in the game that can't be expressed due to the technological and artistic limitations of the actual game medium. Like, because you know, 32 by 32 sprites are kind of hard to read words in. So this is going to be official art for like items or maybe art books or supplementary material that explains in depth more things with characters. It just has to be official. After we gather all this evidence, all of these temporal markers, we will then be comparing them across games to find points of distinction between them and construct our timelines from there. Also, we will be using quotes and things said by developers about mainline games, not necessarily as evidence, but more so as a tool to contextualize the evidence we do find and use throughout this process. A final note before we start, because I know Jared, with his room temp IQ and inability to understand the word canonical, is going to bring it up in the comments if I don't mention it. So I'm going to mention it. The 1997 Satoshi Tajiri interview. Just as a heads up, this aside is going to cover a lot of ground, but also establish for you the types of evidence and approach to canonizing I'm going to take. So make sure you're sitting comfy. This is important. Also, I just realized room temp IQ is much less of an insult in America than it is for the rest of the world. So, Jared, you have Celsius IQ. I sell at the gates. Anyway, the 1997 Famimanga64 interview with the creator of Pokémon, Satoshi Tajiri. In this interview, Tajiri is recounting a conversation he had with Miyamoto about trying to make each cartridge individual for the first Pokémon games. Tajiri was telling Miyamoto how they were going to assign each cartridge an ID number between 1 and 65,000, so that if the player ever traded with someone else, it was likely they were trading with a distinctly differently ID'd and looking game world. Trading with a parallel reality, some might say, a different timeline. Miyamoto said, cool, but consumers are stupid and don't care. So make the cartridges different colors because that's easier for the little pea-brains to understand. This obviously is not paraphrased and is completely verbatim. They spoke in English. But what I can gather from the translation of this interview is the whole split title thing, red and green/red and blue, was all symbolism for the idea that each player's game cartridge is its own parallel world. You could say even their own timeline in a sense. But we're talking about the narrative canonical timeline. So we need to discover if interactions between these two parallel worlds is important to the narrative and canon. So is trading and battling between two different cartridges a timeline interaction? If so, that begs the question, do player interactions between these parallel worlds affect the canonical timelines? Let's see. Now, to see if players trading between parallel world games is actually important in how we are to interpret the canonical timelines, we need to know how Tajiri's statement and symbolism interfaces with the actual games. Because remember, we're talking about the canonical timelines, the narrative continuities. We need to see how characters in the narrative, or just in the world, deal with Tajiri's idea. What do the characters in the game think about this whole each cartridge is a parallel world thing? Is it even brought up in the games? Does it matter? Kind of, mostly. Not really. Characters do often ponder about parallel worlds. For example, this guy in Opelucid City in Black and White, he wonders about Opelucid maybe looking different from what he's currently experiencing. This is obviously a direct reference to the fact that Opelucid looks different from Pokemon Black to Pokemon White. Futuristic in one, old-ass, stony in the other. Different cartridges, very clearly different parallel realities. But this character doesn't make any assertions that he understands this to really exist in the narrative. He just ponders about it. Oras is probably the biggest title when it comes to the mention of parallel realities by in-narrative, in-world characters. Zinnia, Archie, and Maxie all contemplate the possibility of parallel universes where they were either the ones trying to revive the legendary and not the other, or AZ possibly never even made/fired the ultimate weapon. But in terms of how players trading with each other between parallel worlds affects the narrative, not really at all. Later in Oras, during the Delta episode, you find that the Devon Corporation has created the link cable, which is given to the player by Steven Stone's dad. The link cable, you know, that cable that you use to trade on all the Game Boys, yeah, they made that into a real in-game narrative device. Now, the big brains over at the Moss Deep Space Center are going to use the link cable to help divert a meteor that's headed straight for Pokemon's version of Earth. Now, Zinnia, big old queen of the lore keepers, she's been doing all this pontificating about timelines and parallel realities, retelling her oral tradition, and when she finds out about the Space Center's link cable plans, she freaks at the scientist there. She's like, oh, this could rip a hole in reality. It will bring disaster. It'll bring bad stuff like your mom and all that. In response, the scientists bring out the biggest, actually, in the whole franchise.
Multiple timelines, Zinnia? Where is your evidence?
As you can see from the quotes behind me, the scientists who are using the link cable call it a warp system. They calculated it would send things far away. They don't claim that it is anything even related to parallel realities. In fact, they seem to not even believe parallel universes even exist. Now, I know people are going to point out that the device used to deliver the link cable is called the dimensional shifter, Ooh, dimensional, dimensions. Does that mean parallel universes? No, not in this context, actually. In the original Japanese, the dimensional shifter is called, this.
次元転移装置
I mastered that. That was so good. The first two kanji create the word jigen. This word is a direct translation of the English word dimension in the mathematical and especially geometric sense. The etymological source of jigen is likely, from what I can find, this 1889 English to Japanese dictionary of mathematical terms called Vocabulary of Mathematical Terms in English and Japanese. What an apt name. Now remember, 1889 was during the height of the Meiji Restoration era, where the Japanese were finally communicating with Westerners for the first time in 200 years. It makes sense that they would need to create new words to describe specific mathematical concepts in the same way English did to help communicate mathematical ideas. So jigen is most often specifically referring to dimensions in the mathematical coordinate sense. That is jigen. With this in mind, dimensional shifter better translates to 3D transfer equipment or coordinate transposition device. It was probably not intended for jigen or dimensional to be used in the sci-fi sense of the word, referring to parallel realities, especially when it's contextualized with what the scientists and Stephen Stone had said about the link cable in the first place. Now, I get what the English translators were getting at with dimensional. It is a perfect direct translation, especially when considering the Japanese word is derived from the English word. But they failed to see the obvious connotation of parallel worlds using the term dimensional would conjure in the middle of a story littered with conversation about parallel realities and divergent timelines. Fucking confusing. Anyway, this whole thing is about the canonical timelines and trading. So with this in-game evidence that we just discussed in mind, we can sort of extrapolate that trading through the link cable is not exactly between parallel worlds. It's confirmed in-game, canonically, that the link cable connects two things that are far away. Like the scientist said, it's a warp system. Now, there is a level of dramatic irony that us, the players, need to pass through here. We are led to believe, through the narrative of the Delta episode, that Zinnia and the Lawkeepers are correct about there being multiple timelines. I just want to make it very clear, just because we are shown this to be true through our experiences of the mainline franchise and the events of the Delta episode specifically, it does not mean that the majority of the Pokemon world and its inhabitants understand this to be true. In fact, the scientist statements in the Delta episode about the link cable and the dimensional shifter prove that even the top end of town in the brains department are unaware of and do not operate as if multiple timelines and realities exist. These scientists made the dimensional shifter and the link cable. They didn't design these devices to be parallel world and dimension traveling objects because they couldn't have. They don't even think that's possible. They aren't operating within that realm of understanding. To them, there are no multiverses. Another huge piece of evidence for this is Celio's network machine in the Fire Red and Leaf Green Sevi Islands postgame that suggests that player interoriginal trading is likely operating within a one-game universe reality as far as the narrative is concerned. But more on that later. So to bring this whole thing back to the problem of is player interaction within the idea of each game cartridge being its own parallel world important when establishing the canonical events of the mainline timelines? Nope, not really. Even if the player is interacting with other timelines when trading and battling, it seems to be a gameplay feature that operates completely separately to the events in the canonical timelines. On top of this, the way the game deals with the link cable in narrative, the player's trading / battling with other players is displayed more so as interactions between faraway trainers as opposed to connecting parallel worlds. So I think we can pretty confidently say that the player interaction within Satoshi Tajiri's idea of each Pokemon game cartridge being its own unique timeline is largely unimportant to completely irrelevant for organizing and deciphering the canonical narrative timelines of the mainline games. So sorry, Jared, your theory dies at the... As for the content of the cartridges themselves being different, I mean, obviously they're different. Take Opaloosa City. They should be considered their own parallel worlds. But practically, we can't draw any straight lines from any specific version of one generation's game to the next. We can't say, for example, Fire Red is directly connected to Ruby more than we can say Leaf Green is. So for the purposes of deriving and establishing these separate timeline continuities, we'll be taking each pair of games as one. Heart Gold and Soul Silver will be treated as one set of events, just like Diamond Pearl Platinum will be considered one, even if the content marginally differs between games. None of the content within these differences disqualifies it from being within one timeline and not the other, except with some exceptions. You'll see as we get into it. Hopefully that gave you all an idea of how this video will work and of the approach I take to gathering evidence and synthesizing it. Also, final final note before we get into this, I swear to God, this one will be short. Ultra Sun and Moon and Ultra Space. Team Rainbow Rocket's entire existence confirms that there are in fact alternate realities and parallel worlds that have different shit happen in them outside of the mainline canonical timelines. So I'm not ignoring Team Rainbow Rocket's existence when organizing the timelines, but we are solely focusing on the canonical narrative timelines of the games, not the other potential infinite set of timelines we've glanced into briefly. Okay, finally, let's start breaking down the canon. Buckle up, kiddos, because this is going to be one wild ride. The timelines. From all my many hours, too many hours of research, I've collated enough evidence to say that in the Pokemon mainline games, there are 4 main narrative continuities, 4 distinct timelines. Well, actually, maybe potentially 5, but until we get there, let's just roll with 4.
What? 4 timelines, Patrick? I thought there were 2.
Exactly. This shit is confusing, Jared. All right, timeline 1. The OG timeline. This is the first verifiably separate timeline in the canon, and it comprises generations 1 and 2. So that's red, blue, green, yellow, and gold, silver, and crystal. Let me take you back in time to 1996. Game Freak is a poor company. Since becoming a game development studio in 1989, they'd only had middling commercial success with their releases. Come on, you're telling me Smart Ball wasn't an international sensation? His balls are smart. Basically, Game Freak, towards 1996, were running on fumes left over after the Creatures Inc. investment. Lots of staff turnover was occurring, and Tajiri himself was taking pay cuts, in fact, no pay, to help facilitate development of Pokemon Red and Green. So, making the first Pokemon games, they were sure thinking, damn, I sure am excited to make another mid-game that isn't going to turn many sales. And Miyamoto on Nintendo's side, the publishing side, was like, Pokemon is a cool concept, but yep, you're going to have another middling game. And then boom, 31 million sales, and the rest is history. But when Game Freak was designing Pokemon, they weren't expecting it to be the runaway success that it was. Quite the contrary, actually. So when they were building the world, there weren't any concrete plans for expansion of the franchise or the need to build a good base of lore for ongoing continuity. As a result of this philosophy, the game world of Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow much more resembled the real world than any of the other entries later in the series. This common reference and appearance of the real world is quite a defining feature of these games. Like, for example, the Kanto region. It's the only region in the entire Pokemon franchise that shares the name with its real-life region that it's based on. In this case, the Kanto region in Japan, the greater Tokyo area. There's also a variety of Pokedex entries that originate from these games that refer to real-world places. I'm sure you've heard. Arcanine and Parasec's entry, China is mentioned, or how in Panitas, Tokyo Tower is mentioned. There are other references too. Blaine mentions Kyoto. Silco scientists mention Russian localities when discussing their international branch. Lieutenant Surge is titled The Lightning American. The list is quite a bit longer than that. Most of these references were retconned by the time Generation 5 rolled around, but they were definitely a defining feature of the mindset during the creation of the OG timeline game, especially Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow. There was no expectation for Pokemon to build a continuous, expanding, interconnected world of its own. You'll see how, as when we dive into later timelines, this drastically changes and how the effort to distinguish the Pokemon world from the real world drastically accelerated over time. But for now, it's a defining feature of this timeline. Okay, now for the canonical events that define the OG timeline. First off, we need some sort of calendar system to mark down temporal events and compare them. Thankfully, as we know, Gen 1 Game Freak love those real-world references. They use a seemingly identical system to the Western Gregorian calendar. This dude in the Pewter Museum said that the moon landing took place on July 20th, 1969. Awesome. So we can definitely use a familiar calendar system to date these games. Now we just need to know when the events of Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow take place. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, no source in-game states or gives evidence towards even a year the events take place. Thankfully, official media is within my realm of evidence analysis, and Creatures Inc. published an official guidebook for Red and Green back in 1996, the title of which simply translates in English as Pokédex. This book was mainly a physical Pokédex with a bunch of unique descriptive entries for Pokemon, but also included some interviews with the Game Freak dev team and also an official speech from Professor Oak. But what we're looking for is in the intro of this book. Pokédex states that, as of 1996, thanks to the investigative and research efforts of Professor Oak, 150 species of Pokemon have been discovered. Amazing. Confirmation, 1996. That's where this all starts. So the events of red, green, blue, and yellow take place in 1996. This is a really important fact to keep in mind for differentiation later. All right, 1999. Gold and Silver were released, with Crystal coming out 1 year later in 2000. Many NPCs and characters from Gold, Silver, and Crystal provide evidence as to how much time has passed since red, green, blue, and yellow, while simultaneously confirming the events of red, green, blue, and yellow to be in the same canon of events as Gold, Silver, and Crystal. This is confirmed by an NPC in a Pokemon Center asserting that 3 years ago, a kid, Red, broke up Team Rocket. This is exactly what happens in the Gen 1 games. Apart from that, there's a large cast of returning characters that verify the timeline continuity between Gens 1 and 2. Examples of this include Sabrina, a bona fide psychic, saying 3 years ago she had a vision of the Crystal player coming for their badge, and also a character mentioning that 3 years ago Professor Oak had completed the Pokedex up to 150 Pokemon. This last quote corroborates our evidence from Pokedex earlier about Oak solidifying the first 150 in 1996. Okay, timeline. Now that we've confirmed that Gold, Silver, and Crystal happened 3 years after the 1996 events of Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow, we can confidently place the events of Gold, Silver, and Crystal in 1999. Another interesting fact in Gen 1 and 2 is how the narrative frames the player character's purpose for filling out the Pokedex. This will be important for timeline differentiation later, so listen up. Now, as I said before, Pokedex, the official book, makes it pretty clear that Professor Oak is the first person to solidify and aggregate the existence of the first 150 Pokemon.
In Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow, the player's Pokedex journey is framed as creating and filling out the first ever encyclopedia for Pokemon, fulfilling Oak's lifelong dream that he himself can't carry out anymore due to old age.
So from this, we can say pretty definitively that as of 1996 and the end events of Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow, that there were only 150 Pokemon discovered in this timeline. Gold, Silver, and Crystal introduced 100 new Pokemon to the franchise, and with in-game evidence, we can pretty definitively say these Pokemon were only discovered between the events of Red, Green, Blue, Yellow, and Gold, Silver, and Crystal. An NPC in New Barktown makes it clear that Professor Elm was the first to discover Pichu and confirm it as a pre-evolution of Pikachu. Because the Pokedex of Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow doesn't have Pichu in it, and we can confirm they're in the same universe as Gold, Silver, and Crystal, we can pretty confidently conclude that all new Pokemon introduced in Gen 2 were discovered between 1996 and the events of Gold, Silver, and Crystal. In both sets of games, the player is sent out to catch and confirm the existence of these Pokemon to help confirm and create an encyclopedia for the professor's research, as these Pokemon have only been recently discovered. This is important because later visits to Kanto and Johto might not treat the discovery of Pokemon in the same way. Keep that in mind. Let's take a look at our timeline. Pretty simple, right? 2 entries in the series, 1 timeline of events that are pretty easily chronologized with in-game evidence. Simple, right? Oh boy, how that is going to change. All right, timeline 2. The non-mega timeline, Generation 3. It's 2002 now. Ruby and Sapphire have just been released, with their definitive version, Emerald, being released 2 years later in 2004. These releases mark the beginning of the 3rd generation of Pokemon. In these games, the player is taken to the new region of Hoenn, where it becomes pretty immediately obvious that Game Freak is trying to recontextualize the setting of Pokemon for a much wider global audience. Like I mentioned previously, this recontextualization was not fully achieved until Gen 5, but some pretty monstrous steps were taken here in Hoenn's first appearance. Now, one of the biggest challenges between the relationship of the last 2 entries in the series and the Hoenn games is that these games are seemingly completely narratively disconnected from Kanto and Johto. Not a single character or NPC is able to confirm any spatial or temporal coordinates that can help us orient our position relative to the time and place of Gen 1 and Gen 2 events. In a 2003 interview, Masuda even says as much. I think it'll be more fun to think of them as separate worlds. We decided it was better to not spell things out concretely, especially as far as the media is concerned. Masuda is now, if you're following the lore, he was Scottish, now he's Southern. Masuda McCree. He says in development, Game Freak thought of Gen 3's Hoenn and previous entries as separate worlds. Now, despite the NPCs and characters not giving us any direct lines to draw from Gen 1 and Gen 2 to the Gen 3 games, they do provide numerous references to the existence of Kanto and Johto in their universe. This left Game Freak with the perfect opportunity to patch some holes and create their first ever remakes. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, remakes of Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow. Fire Red and Leaf Green are very close to faithful recreations of the original Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow. However, there is some expanded Sevi Islands content that points towards these remakes being from a different, separate timeline. In the Sevi Islands, you meet Celio and his network machine. This network machine enables the Fire Red and Leaf Green player to trade with copies of Ruby and Sapphire. Celio says,
I've managed to link up with trainers in the Hoenn region. Finally!
now before this becomes a possibility, the network machine has a couple of requirements to meet before Celio gets it working in narrative. These requirements can only be completely met after the main story of Fire Red and Leaf Green has been completed. Meanwhile, in Hoenn, the player can't trade with Kanto until after the events of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald's main story, until after the player receives the National Pokédex. The implication of this being that the events of Fire Red and Leaf Green and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald take place at the same time, as both Kanto and Hoenn can't trade with each other until either protagonist has made it to the postgame and Celio has activated the machine. Another implication that we can make here is that the Kanto of Fire Red and Leaf Green and the Kanto of Red, Green, Blue, Yellow, and Crystal can't possibly be the same. Celio's machine, the Sevi Islands, and the Generation 3 Pokemon do not exist in Gen 1 and 2. Hoenn isn't even mentioned. And if we can confirm through Celio's machine's activation enabling trades between Kanto and Hoenn that the narrative events of Fire Red and Leaf Green and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are effectively simultaneous, we can unequivocally determine that Fire Red and Leaf Green and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are in a different timeline and narrative continuity from Red, Green, Blue, Yellow, and Gold, Silver, and Crystal. An ill-informed Jared might postulate,
How could this possibly be true? Johto doesn't exist in Generation 3 yet. Its Pokemon are in the National Dex.
honestly, Jared, fair point. However, you got a little bit of silly brain going on. Game Freak obviously made the National Dex completable in Generation 3, and it was impossible to trade between the first two generations and Gen 3. We ain't in the Pokemon Home era yet, not even the Pal Park era. All the Johtonian Pokemon are found throughout the regions of both Kanto and Hoenn in this timeline, so it's fair enough to assume that these Pokemon were either first recorded outside of Johto or previously / contemporaneously recorded in a Johto we haven't visited yet. Now, the biggest problem we have so far with the non-Mega timeline is that we don't actually have a definite date or year to place the events of Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. We do, however, know that they still use a Gregorian calendar, as the same man from the Pune Museum dates the moon landing as 1969 again. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as just assuming that this all takes place in 1996, as attractive as an option as that sounds. As this is a new timeline, we can't simply use Creatures Inc.'s Pokedex again, because we confirmed that Fire Red and Leaf Green aren't in the same universe as Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow. And to my knowledge, there isn't a single in-game example or piece of official supplementary media that confirms the exact year that these games take place. But do not fear, oh little Jared. There is in fact confirmation coming further down the line, so just hold on tight. So just to be clear, as we close out Generation 3, we've concluded that Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald take place at the same time, and they also exist in a separate timeline / narrative continuity from the first two generations of games. That's what we know so far. With that said, let's move on to Generation 4. In 2006, we're met with the releases of Diamond and Pearl, with Platinum coming out in 2008. This generation also includes Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which are remakes of Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Now, basic facts. We know the Pokedex in this game contains up to 493 Pokemon, which is more than the 386 that are present in Generation 3. This puts the events of both Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver after the events of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald and Fire Red and Leaf Green. But how far? And when did Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver take place relative to each other? The first big piece of evidence we receive is in the very opening of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. We get a glimpse of a TV documentary about the Red Gyarados at the Lake of Rage in Johto. Later in the story, a man with a TV crew blocking the entrance to Lake Valis states that he was the one who filmed that Red Gyarados. This seems to suggest that the events of Sinnoh happened during a similar time to the Heart Gold Soul Silver events of Johto and Kanto, as we could see the Red Gyarados in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Another big point of evidence that places Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver around the same time is Jasmine's appearance in both Sinnoh and Johto / Kanto across these games. Now, in the main story of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, we meet Jasmine at Sunyshore. She is the character through which the player receives the Waterfall HM. When the player first meets her, she's a bit of a nervous wreck. She states she's a gym leader in Johto and she's traveled to the Sinnoh region to get stronger. That's about it for this encounter. To be clear, the player meets Jasmine before they've defeated the Sinnoh League and become champion. That's an important thing to note. Now, in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, after you've defeated the Indigo League for the first time, you go to Kanto and complete the Kanto Gym Challenge and meet all the Cantonian gym leaders. When registering Erica, the Celadon City gym leader, in your Pokegear, you come across her having a conversation with Jasmine, where she basically says, time to put on my prettiest, girliest Erica voice.
Oh, Jasmine. People think you dress ugly.
Really?
I was gonna do Sinnoh contest, but people keep telling me I dress ugly, so I pussied out.
Have you thought about dressing not ugly?
No, I haven't thought of that, Erica. I will dress not ugly now and do the Sinnoh contests.
That is what they sound like. If I should voice act. Pokemon should have voice acting in the games, and I should just do all of it. I think I'm good I'm getting the characters right, the vibe. Now, if you've ever done contests in Sinnoh, you know that none of the top tier coordinators, including Jasmine, appear in Master Rank contests until after you've defeated the Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum League and entered the Hall of Fame. The whole implication of this being that Jasmine was in Sinnoh for all the story events of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum up until Sunny Shore, popped back over to Johto for the events of Heart Gold, Soul Silver, then after receiving some questionable encouragement from Erica, returns to Sinnoh and joins the Super Contest sometime after the Sinnoh protagonist has defeated the Pokemon League. She then returns back to Kanto and Johto because the Heart Gold, Soul Silver protagonist then is traded Jasmine's Steelix named Rusty, which is the same Steelix that Jasmine uses in her Sinnoh Super Contest. That was a lot of words. But basically, the events of these games prove that Jasmine moves between the narratives of both games as they were going on, which confirms them to be in the same timeline.
But Patrick, I can go visit Jasmine at any time in Heart Gold and Soul Silver at the Olivine Gym. Surely what you're saying about this can't be true. They can't be at the same time.
Well, unfortunately for you, Jared, silly, stupid, farty poo bum Jared, you freak, Game Freak was just not too concerned with making canonical events stick to a strict timeline at the time of these games. In an interview with Game Informer in 2019, Masuda basically said,
If you look too closely, things get complicated. We fucked up with that in the past, so don't apply timeline logic too rigorously. We just want to make a cool, growing Pokemon world.
Again, Masuda, he's a bit of a shapeshifter. I don't know why he sounds so different every time. It's crazy. Now, Masuda's not saying there isn't a timeline of events, just that when implementing characters into a story, Game Freak is more concerned with making the world feel rich with characters and interactions, more so than they are into justifying characters' strict travel times between regions. Because think about it, wouldn't it just be weird if Jasmine was missing from her gym sometimes in Heart Gold, Soul Silver and couldn't be found for no obvious, discernible reason to the player? Or if when Oak travels to Eterna City in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, he's just randomly missing from Pallet Town in Heart Gold, Soul Silver? It seems Game Freak would rather the world be more interactable and for the player to fill in the gaps themselves than to follow a strict per-character timeline progression. Anyway, the Red Gyarados and Jasmine's interregional presence basically prove that the events of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver, both the main story and the post-game, happen somewhat concurrently. This is further corroborated by Cynthia's appearance in the Arceus special distribution event in the post-game of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, in which she is already clearly knowledgeable about Giratina, the Distortion World, and the rest of the Creation Trio, which she only found out about definitively during the events of Platinum at Spear Pillar. Okay, now that we know Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver take place at similar times, let's see if we can confirm they take place in the same timeline as the Gen 3 games. Yeah, we can pretty easily confirm that. All the statements in Gold, Silver, and Crystal about Team Rocket being broken up and Sabrina's vision and so forth are still in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. This confirms that the events of Fire Red and Leaf Green happened 3 years before the events of Heart Gold and Soul Silver. This in combination with a new corroborating quote that Giovanni provides in the Celebi event, he mentions that the Heart Gold Soul Silver protagonist reminds him of the kid who stood in front of me 3 years ago. That's actually accurate to how Giovanni sounds in game. I can't believe you didn't know that. That's what he sounds like. Reminder, we also know that we aren't in the same continuity as red, green, blue, and yellow because the size of the decks is different between Gens 2 and 4. So Diamond, Pearl, Platinum, and Heart Gold, Soul Silver take place 3 years after Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. All right, awesome. All the Gen 3 and Gen 4 games take place in the same timeline, but we still don't have dates or years or anything. We know the events of these games are relative temporal positions on the same timeline, but we don't have any actual calendar markers, just some fancy question marks. But oh wait, we do have confirmed calendar dates. This one is shocking, so ground yourself or you might find shortly that you've been electrocuted. And look, if I unintentionally kill you, your mum is not going to be impressed. And that's all I'm looking to do, impress. Okay, Pokemon Platinum event distribution. The famous Darkrai event. The actual distributed item for this was called the Member Card, which was first released on December 1st, 2008. Its item description reads, a card needed for entering the inn in Canalave City. Oddly, the last date marked on it was 50 years ago. In the official artwork of this item, the date engraved on the item shows the date, 1st of December, 1958. even if it's really fucking hard to read, I can confirm, and you can too, use your eyes, that it does say that. 1st of December, 1958. For any maths fans in the room, this should be an easy one for you. 1958 plus 50 equal 2008. This confirms that the events of Pokemon Platinum take place in 2008, which curiously is very different from the 1999 we would get if we followed the chronology of the OG timeline. So just to spell things out for you, we can confirm that Platinum takes place in 2008, and we can also confirm through Jasmine that Heart Gold and Soul Silver is set at the same time. So 2008, 2008. We also know that Heart Gold Soul Silver takes place 3 years after the events of Fire Red and Leaf Green, which is concurrent with Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald through Celio's network machine, which places both of the Gen 3 games in 2005. Okay, we're done with Gen 4, finally. Generation 5. I'm sure you all know the lore. Generation 5 was meant to be a soft reboot for the Pokemon franchise. In fact, Unova was the first mainline region not based on a real geographic region of Japan. And for the first time ever, Game Freak finally decided to strap on its big boy narrative boots and put some slightly deeper philosophical commentary within its story. Black and White's protags and subject matter were a little bit more mature in these games compared to previous entries in the series. This is also, to my knowledge, the first generation of games where any reference to the real world was totally removed. No Pokédex entries, no character histories, no nothing. This became the standard for the Pokemon mainline franchise going forwards. So as this game is a total soft reboot, its references to other generations and regions are few and far between, making these games pretty hard to place on our timelines. Thankfully, Game Freak just barely put enough evidence in there to place it on the non-Mega timeline. First off, we know these games take place after the events of Generation 4 as the Pokédex has grown in size to 649 Pokemon. And there are passing references to Team Rocket and Team Galactic's plans already having failed. Team Rocket is actually kind of important here. In fact, it's pretty much the only way we can determine the length of time that has passed between Generations 4 and Generations 5, and one of the few pieces of evidence that confirm the Gen 5 games to be in the non-Mega timeline. There is a man in a house in Icarus City who speaks kind of funny, claiming he was a member of Team Rocket a long time ago. But now he's come back to his home region, initially with the intent to reform his evil team, but instead knocked up a girl and got stuck working a 9-to-5 to support his newly born son. Classic, relatable story for everyone here, I'm sure. Jared, I think this one applies to you. Dramatic reading time. Let's read him in Scottish, shall we? He gives off Jared vibes, as I was saying anyway, you know, a bit lacking in the mental faculties.
Oh, member of Team Rocket I was, long time gone. But Team Rocket bye-bye a go-go. I, my region, went home. Make new Team Rocket I did. So myself I pledged, but now I married. Now for Team Rocket there is no time by me, but a happy family is a big hurry.
Now, if you're a fan of the series, you might recall a Rocket Grunt who saw the machine part in Heart Gold Soul Silver with a very similar speech pattern, who, after his dastardly Heart Gold Soul Silver plans are foiled, says to the player,
I my country go home, make Team Rocket I will, goodbye, so long.
So we can pretty much confirm this is the same dude, right? I'm not a detective, but I'm pretty confident this is the only man in history brave enough to talk to multiple children wearing that leather jacket. All I'm saying is. Anyway, in Black and White, this former Team Rocket Grunt's son has the school kid trainer class sprite. Now, the Japanese version is more specific in what this trainer class actually is. The original text calls it
塾帰り
which specifically translates to coming home from cram school, or juku. For the uninitiated, Juku is extracurricular classes students take to help prepare them for internal or external school examinations. Now, judging by the age of this sprite, this child is probably getting ready for middle school selection exams, which would place him in the age range of 9 to 12 years old. To translate for the people that speak my variety of Sydney English, this is like going to tutoring college with your Korean mate Jang for a couple of weeks before the selective test, because your mum wants you to have a right go at it and do your best so you can get into James Roos and become a darn doctor. Sorry, I do not know where that came from. Anyway, the child is probably between the ages of 9 and 12. And if we factor in the fact that his dad didn't immediately have a child and get married when he got back to Unova, we can reasonably say the time between Gen 4 and Gen 5 is about 12 years. Caitlin's aged up appearance in the Unovan Elite Four seems to track with this 12 years time difference, making her 26, as she was confirmed to be 14 in Gen 4's Battle Frontier. Considering all of that, this puts Black and White in the year 2020. Its sequels are confirmed to take place 2 years afterwards, putting Black 2 and White 2 in 2022. Okay, that's the non-mega timeline completed. Look at it in all of its glory. The first 5 generations all chronologized and universified. This is a mighty fine looking timeline. Well, timelines, I should say. Oh, and what's this? A deleted tweet from longtime Game Freak writer Toshinobu Matsumiya's Twitter in 2014 confirming every conclusion I've come to? How convenient. If anyone knows the timelines, it would be him. Now, before I jump into the next timeline, the mega timeline, I'd like to clear up a few things about this tweet and how it interfaces with my timelines. Now, Matsumiya does not seem to differentiate between the remakes of games when compared to the originals. He just lumps the events of Gen 1 and 2 in with 3 and 4. He also puts X and Y here on the same timeline as these other games, which, as we'll get into later, is kind of impossible to justify they exist in the same continuity after ORAS and the Delta episode. So I'm going to make a few assumptions about this tweet. One being that the separated timelines were compressed here for brevity's sake. Remember, this is Twitter. 2, this tweet was likely just meant to communicate the general idea of events. Obviously, the events of Heart Gold, Soul Silver, and Crystal are really similar, but having to make that distinction in a tweet is kind of hard to do. I don't know if you've looked at the length of this video, but it's also kind of hard to do with an over 12,000 word script. Now, I know some of you will just appeal to authority, and that's cool, but I'd like to think that deep down, Mr. Matsumiya agrees with my analysis. I know, huge ego. But to be fair, my back and my eyes do hurt a lot from all the research. Anyway, next timeline. The mega timeline. This is the beginning of the end for Game Freak's stretch of consistency and continuity in their timeline construction. Unfortunately, the mega timeline is not as neatly organized as the non-mega timeline was. Many potential plot holes or unelaborated assertions from characters leave a lot up to speculation. That's right, this is where shit gets confusing. Honestly, fuck Balls Diamond and Stinky Pearl. You'll see later. Fuck that game. Never did anything good for me, or you, or the franchise. Okay, constructing the timeline. This is what we know. In Generation 6, the Pokédex has expanded to 721 Pokémon, and we know through Dexio that the fairy type has only recently been classified. And if Matsumiya is to be believed that the events of Black 2 and White 2 happen at the same time as the events of X and Y, we're left with a bunch of assumptions, chief of those being that X and Y must take place in a different narrative continuity to the non-mega timeline. We've played Black 2 and White 2. There is no fairy type, and the dex finishes at 649 instead of 721. This shouldn't make sense if we track dex expansion the same way we did in the non-mega timeline. Now, many people seem to think that at this point in time, the presence of megas in the games themselves prove that X and Y is on a different timeline to the prior games. However, X and Y wasn't actually confirmed to be in the new timeline until ORAS. In Pokemon X and Y, Professor Sycamore seems to suggest that the mysterious Mega Evolution phenomenon is hardly known about and seems to be unaware of its presence in regions outside of Kalos. This then seems to track fine with Kalos being in the same timeline as Black 2 and White 2, as it's reasonable to believe that it's the only region that has Megas. Yet in ORAS, where we return to Hoenn, there is Mega Evolution. Like I said earlier, Zinnia states in the Delta episode that there are multiple timelines that can, at least in this case, be distinguished around the firing of the ultimate weapon, the genesis of Mega Evolution. From her statement, we can extrapolate that the Hoenn region seen in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald is not the Hoenn we see in ORAS, which is kind of obvious considering the diverging events of the main story from ORAS to Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, and now also the presence of Mega Evolution. All this proves is that we can't determine if any entry in the series is definitively not in the Mega timeline by the emission of Megas in a particular game. It does, however, prove that if a Pokemon game does have Megas, it can't be in the non-Mega timeline. Confusing, I know, but basically if a game has Megas, it can't be in the non-Mega timeline. But if it doesn't have Megas appear in it, it can still be in the Mega timeline. Hope that makes sense. Okay, back to structuring the timeline. We also know that Mr. Bonding, the O-Powers guy from X and Y, is actually first met in ORAS before he goes to Kalos to power some O's or whatever he does. This tells us that ORAS takes place sometime before X and Y. Interestingly enough, if ORAS takes place before X and Y and it has fairy types, there is no way that Black 2 and White 2, or even Black and White for that matter, should not have fairy types if they were to reside in the same timeline. Unless there was some crazy North Korea-esque, isolationist, authoritarian government control going on in Unova, there should be fairy types. That seems impossible. So we know X and Y take place at the same time as a mega timeline version of the Black 2 and White 2 events, and we know ORAS happens sometime before X and Y, but we don't know how long before X and Y. Now, if we were to just match up ORAS with Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald along the timelines, we would say that X and Y happens 20 years after the events of Oras. But that doesn't seem to track with Dexio's statement about the fairy type being only recently discovered, or Sycamore's unawareness of the Mega Evos in Hoenn. So it's much more likely that the events of Oras happened much closer to X and Y than RSE happened to Black 2 and White 2. So how close? Thankfully, we get some hints that help us estimate a placement. Throughout Oras, many characters let us know about the discontinuation of many features that were once present in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, such as the guy in the contest hall that mentions a machine that is used to make Pokeblocks, or how a bug catcher in Rustboro describes the RSE design of Pokemon centers having changed to the current Oras design about 10 years ago. These references seem to paint the picture that in this timeline, there was a version of Hoenn in the past that much more resembled the Hoenn of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. This lets us put Oras closer to the events of X and Y, but it's not until the player gets the Eon ticket and talks to Norman that we find out how close Oras actually is to X and Y. When the player takes this Eon ticket to Norman, Norman says that the last time he saw one was 11 or 12 years ago, depending on your translation. This is a clear reference to the time passed since the original event distribution of the Eon ticket, which is why it changes depending on the translation. English-speaking countries got it later than the Japanese versions did. Now, this doesn't confirm that the events of RSE happened in the Mega Timeline in some sort of weird event loop thing. All it confirms is that these Eon tickets were last distributed about 12 years ago, using the Japanese time frame here because it was the initial release. So if we add 12 years onto the RSE dates, we get Oras sitting 5 years before the events of X and Y. This makes Dexio's line about the fairy type being recent make a little bit more sense. 5 years is recent, I guess, in the scientific world. They do say science moves slowly. Unfortunately, it just seems that Sycamore's statement about Mega Evos only being in the Kalos region will forever be a plot hole in my timelines, unless they expand somewhere that Sycamore is a complete fraud and just has no idea about anything that's going on. Or maybe he received some head trauma after his time researching with Rowan. To be fair, Rowan does look like the sort of guy that would believe in the efficacy of corporal punishment. All I'm saying, he just got a little bit of a, look to him. Okay, that's Gen 6 done. Now on to Sun and Moon and Generation 7. The evidence for these games is much more simple, so it's easy to place them on the timelines. Dexio and Cena show up in the post-games, giving the player access to Mega Evolution. That means we can't place Sun and Moon on the non-Mega timeline. We also get appearances from Colress and Grimsley, who are from the Mega timeline version of Black 2 and White 2, which we know happened contemporaneously with the events of X and Y. A note on some officially released concept art of Grimsley states that 2 years have passed since his last appearance, neatly placing Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon 2 years after X and Y. Wally's appearance in the battle tree also seems to confirm this, as he would be 17 now if we follow the 7 years on from Oras, where he's confirmed to be 10. His model/textures do seem to have changed slightly between Oras and Sun and Moon, but for some people the differences are not clear enough to show that 7 years have passed. I'll put the two up here for you to decide. An alternative theory is they were treated like the gym leaders were in the Pokemon World Tournament in Black and White 2, where seemingly for familiarities and maybe time savings sake, they didn't change any of the gym leaders' sprite. This could totally be the case for Wally too. Red and Blue also show up to introduce the player to the battle tree, and they've clearly aged quite a bit. Red also has a 96 on his shirt, which is interesting. This is the first suggestion of actual dates or even the use of the Gregorian calendar that the Mega Timeline has. If we are to assume that the 96 on Red's shirt is a reference to the beginning of his adventure starting in 1996, we can actually place the entire Mega Timeline in line with the OG timeline. Of course, we would have to imagine a mega version of red, green, blue, and yellow took place, and that's where this red is from, but boom, we can date everything now. To do this, we might have to do a little bit of witchcraft and wizardry though. If we temporarily shift back the non-mega timeline from 2005 to 1996 and assume there is an alternate mega timeline entry for every game on this list, we can place our substitute red, green, blue, and yellow in 1996. X and Y then lines up with Black 2 and White 2 in 2013, Oras coming 5 years before in 2008, and Sun and Moon and Ultra Sun and Moon 7 years after in 2015. This is what the mega timeline looks like so far. Now, the sharp of mind amongst you might posit that Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are the games that the red and blue we see in Sun and Moon are from. But unfortunately, this is highly implausible. Whilst these versions of Kanto do feature red and blue and do feature Mega Evolution, they do have one glaring difference that prevents them from being in the Mega timeline. Mina, who is the Pony Island trial captain of Sun and Moon, features in Let's Go, and official artwork for his appearance in those games states she is 13 to 15 years old. If Let's Go games take place around 1996 due to Red's appearance in Sun and Moon, 19 years would have passed between the events of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee and Sun and Moon. This would make Mina 32 to 34 in the Generation 7 games. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem, apart from the fact that Mallow, another trial captain, says in Sun and Moon that they have to rescind their trial captain status after the age of 20. This seemingly innocuous fact disqualifies the Let's Go games from occurring in the Mega Timeline. So I've gone and made its own little timeline here that you can see. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee all cute by itself, happening at some mysterious time in a different narrative continuity. Okay, final notes for Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. This is mostly an aside. Like I said before, there are a couple of instances of Ultra Wormholes confirming that different realities and timelines exist outside of the main canonical ones. Primary example of this is Team Rainbow Rocket, where the main villains come from timelines where they were able to follow through successfully with their plans and weren't thwarted by a little 10 to 16-year-old. I think a more important example, though, is Annabelle's appearance in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Annabelle's first appearance in the series is as a frontier brain in Emerald. When we meet her in Ultra Sun and Moon, we find out she's a fool, or someone who's been displaced in space-time due to an ultra wormhole. She seems to have not only fallen through space and time, but also through universes, as the game suggests that she's the Annabelle, the same Annabelle we met in Emerald. I'm leaving the exploration of this specific phenomenon for a later video, but I just wanted to make it clear that Game Freak opening up the potential for inter-universal travel makes telling interconnected stories through all this timeline shit way more potentially confusing to the player. Alright, that does it for Gen 7. Now we move on to Gen 8 and Gen 9. Generation 8 and 9. The threads that connect these games to the mega timelines and each other are really not the strongest, but they do connect. It seems backwards, but let's start with Scarlet and Violet. We can confirm this game takes place on a mega timeline through Roaring Moon's Violet Pokédex entry. We can also confirm that the events of Sword and Shield take place within the same continuity and before the events of Scarlet and Violet, as Sonia's published book that recounts some of the Sword and Shield events can be found at the Players Academy. We can also verify that Leventon and his research in Hisui happened in the same continuity as Scarlet and Violet, as we see visual reference to him in one of Rifle's classes. We also know that Legends Arceus and BDSP are directly tied through a book in the Canonade library in BDSP called The Sea's Legend, which is about the Manaphy quest the player character does in Pokemon Legends Arceus. PLA we know comes before BDSP, and due to BDSP's Pokédex containing only 493 Pokemon, we can confirm that its events take place before Oras. So we know the timeline of these games goes PLA, then BDSP, then Sword and Shield sometime later, and finally Scarlet and Violet. Now, there's nothing stopping me from just assuming that BDSP lines up with a potential mega timeline version of Gold, Silver, and Crystal, just like how Heart Gold and Silver lined up with Diamond, Platinum, and Pearl. However, I can't find a single piece of evidence that definitively proves BDSP's timeline position. I can prove that BDSP is a bitch. Honestly, I would expect that from Jared's favorite game. Because the Pokédex of BDSP contains only 493 Pokemon, we can safely assume that it takes place before the events of Oras, like I said earlier. However, there is one little problem here. The Fairy type is in BDSP. If we believe the Fairy type to have only been incredibly recently discovered in Oras, it seems wholly unreasonable to assume that BDSP should have the Fairy type at all. If only Ilka made a true faithful remake without the Fairy type, I wouldn't have to deal with all this dumb-ass, stupid-ass narrative dissonance. So I have two options here. Make a whole new timeline for all four of these games, or try to justify the Fairy type's existence in BDSP to place these four games on the Mega Timeline. Now, we saw before that I'm willing to dismiss even more egregious plot holes to keep the timelines together, like Sycamore's statements about the regional exclusivity of Mega Evolution. So I'm going to give myself a little leeway to work with BDSP here. Apart from strictly gameplay-related things like menus, the Pokédex, and one quote from a man outside the Veilstone gym who is describing type matchups, the Fairy type isn't mentioned at all. So I'm going to put all my eggs in the Ilka was told to keep the gameplay mechanics consistent for the generation over keeping things strictly narratively cohesive basket. That's my cope. With all that said, I'm going to place all of these games on the Mega Timeline, and I will leave them there until someone finds evidence that fully disqualifies them. So, BDSP is sometime before Oras. If we match it up with the original timeline, it's probably in 1999. PLA happens way before that at some undetermined date. If we track with the real-world Meiji Restoration and colonization of Hokkaido, PLA probably happens somewhere in the mid to late in-universe version of the 19th century. Let's just say 1860s-ish for now. Finally, in terms of what specific dates we can give Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, all we have is a Pokédex entry from Violet that states Mimikyu was only recently discovered. So we're going to play Scarlet and Violet sometime after Ultra Sun and Moon, and then using Sonia's book we can place Sword and Shield shortly before that. Also, a final note, just to mention Skull and Violet DLCs, all they really contribute is they confirm that a version of Unova exists in this timeline, and we know the DLCs happen directly after the events of Skull and Violet, so we're just going to lump them in with Skull and Violet. That's it. That's all the game's done. We did it. I'm losing my fucking mind. Please, for the love of God, subscribe. Anyway, I hope you can see that this shit, the timelines, is confusing as fuck. And the differentiation and chronology is not obvious to the average player at all. This shit is brain destroying, okay? My brain ain't no way your average Pokemon fan is spending weeks researching this topic and then condensing their thoughts and analysis down to a 12,000 word script. I might be crazy, but most people aren't. And like I said in my last video, since the 3D era started way back in 2013, Game Freak seems to love using time, space, and dimensional travel to tell its stories, and is increasingly doing this. We got Annabelle, Looker, Ingo, Older, and many more whose stories either have yet to be explained or have just been completely ignored. But like, there's no way they ignore the Older/Hiro Hisui story, right? That one seems way too fucking important. And Ingo too, that seems like a tee up for the next Unova revisit. So please, Game Freak, I beg you, in one of your upcoming titles, preferably Legend Zeta A, please clear this shit up for us players. Definitively choose a timeline for your games to operate in it, so our poor little gamers don't have to decode whatever the fuck this is. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the unraveling of the mainline Pokemon canonical timelines and can see how confusing and stupid it all is at the gates. Look, after making this video, I thought I was about to see the gates, so I would like to thank you for watching. We're nearly at the end. This piece was heavily inspired by Kiskeym's work. One of his works I have linked below, and it's a really good companion piece for this video. We provide different evidence and different information at times, but come to mostly the same conclusions from mostly the same sources about the timelines. So if you ever want to reference something I said in this video, but don't want to have to scrub through it, go check out Kiskeym's article, and it's probably in there. I don't know if they create content anywhere else, but go read their stuff. They have a ton of well-founded, evidence-based readings of Pokemon lore and some great theories. They were a big help writing this video, and I'm a huge fan. So go check that out. The link will be really obvious below. Another amazing source for this video was Dr. Lava and their translations of Japanese exclusive media like developer interviews and official Japan-only guidebooks and art books. This is all available on their website, lavacutcontent.com. Go check that out if you're interested, an indispensable source for any Pokemon history-related research. The rest of my sources will also be linked below. They are completely disorganized and non-referenced because my process for this video was kind of manic, but if you want to do the digging, you'll be able to find evidence for hopefully every claim I've made in this video. If you've made it this far, you are absolutely a real one. And if you haven't already, fucking subscribe. What are you doing? Watching a video this long all the way to the end and not subscribing? What are you, the average YouTube watcher? Do it. Subscribe. Do it now. This is the most effort I put into researching, writing, filming, and editing ever for this channel. So I really hope your mum liked it, and I really hope you liked it. I love Pokemon lore and discussion, so I would love to hear from you guys about your thoughts on the canonical timelines and their establishment. There's probably a ton of evidence that I've missed, so if you have anything that supports my theory or even undermines it, I'd love to hear about it in the comments so we can have a respectful discussion and debate. Also, follow my Twitter. We can discuss things there too, and you'll get a constant stream of the hottest, sexiest Pokemon takes you've ever heard, like how AZ is a war criminal under the Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute. In my opinion, that's not controversial, but it might be to you, so follow me there. It's at Patrick Your Mum, PatrickYurmum. Anyway, gamers, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you at the gates.